Here we go. It's the title of the book, Dreaming Ahead of Time, Experiences with Precognitive Dreams, Synchronicity, and Coincidence. And I go into all of those things in the book through my own experience, but also through the experiences of others. And with any luck, I'll get on to some of the people that I look into. Previous time-haunted men, in the phrase by the writer J.B. Priestley, a very famous 20th century writer who isn't really read that much these days, but he was very, very famous in his day, who wrote plays and some novels having to do with strange experiences of time. And he was a time-haunted man. And here's kind of a generic, dreamy kind of image. Because it's one of the strange things, I mean, we have dreams, and then when you have a precognitive, I mean, dreams are strange enough in the first place. And I have a kind of potted history of dreams and dream interpretation, or different civilizations throughout history, because people have been interested in dreams as far back as we can, well, as far back as sort of historical records. I mean, one of the things I point out that the earliest kind of dream records on Earth were in the mid-19th century, when the sort of palace of Ashurbanipal, the Babylonian king, was uncovered, and they found these stone tablets of records of dreams that he had collected going back for thousands of years. So Ashurbanipal is pretty ancient in the first place, 600 around there BC, but he had collected and held on to these ancient stone tablets about dreams from earlier kings going back 2 millennia. And among those, that collection was also Gilgamesh, which is the first sort of work of kind of great literature, we consider great literature. And in itself is one of the first accounts of a dream interpretation itself in there. And that is a interesting coincidence, or however, maybe not, but in some way they're linked together, because dreams are very much like literary creations. We tell a story, they have characters and so on and so on, they use metaphor and all that. So as I looked into this, I found all these sort of resonances that kind of worked. And how I wound up writing the book, well, this happened in 2019, so it's spring around there of 2019, so I guess that's about 3 years ago already. And I was giving a talk at Brompton Cemetery, and this is part of, there's a group in London here called Curious Invitation, and they do a variety of very interesting kind of site-specific talks and events. And I've done actually quite a few events with them in different cemeteries, but this was something that they call the borderlands of sleep. So they have a thematic, a theme for these series of events and talks. And I gave a talk about hypnagogia. And hypnagogia is this in-between state between sleeping and waking that we all pass through twice, when we fall asleep at night, or whenever we fall asleep, and whenever we wake up. There's some slight there's some hair split between the two. Friedrich Myers, the great parapsychological pioneer in the late 19th century with the Society of Psychical Research, he coined the phrase, the term hypnopompic, for when we're waking up. Hypnagogue leads you into sleep, and the hypnopomp leads you out of sleep. But all intents and purposes, it's this liminal in-between state. And you can hover in that, you can learn how to remain in there, and you can watch dreams start to unfold, you hear voices, you see strange patterns, jeweled landscapes, and just strange states of kind of in-between dreams and waking. But it's a state that's also prone to a variety of paranormal phenomena, one of which was precognition. So at the end of this talk about hypnagogia, which is fascinating in itself, I tacked on some accounts of precognitive dreams, because I said it's this state that's given towards kind of precognition. And I tacked on a couple of my own experiences of precognitive dreams and hypnagogia, which we'll get on to. But the next day, and well, I said at the end of the talk, I said, and if you want to find out whether this happens to you, all you have to do is start writing your dreams down. Just write your dreams down, and you'll see. And I'll get onto that as well. But that's the easiest way to find out if you have precognitive dreams, is just write your dreams down, pay attention to them over a while. Don't try to interpret them. Don't get heavy with them. Just write them down, and then be aware of what's happening, in your waking state, which is good advice anytime anyway. And you'll see, bingo, it'll happen. And it doesn't have to be years in advance, you know, it's the next day. And this is what happened here. I'm getting to is, so I said, write your dreams down and see what happens. So the next day I went onto Twitter, and the first thing I saw was a tweet from someone who had been at the talk at Brompton Cemetery, Hypnagogia. And she had written, OMG, and, you know, 3 exclamation points. It's true. I dreamed the future. I went to this talk and da-da-da-da. Somehow managed to get it all in. But she said that what had happened was that that morning, after, you know, the night after the talk, that night, she had dreamt that about picking a hedgehog up off the road and putting it on the pavement where it would be safe. And that morning when she woke up, when she went onto Twitter, the first thing she saw in her Twitter feed was a tweet about how to protect the hedgehogs. So she said, it's true. This guy said, write my dreams down, and I'd see that I dreamed the future, and there it was. So I thought that was a sign. Maybe it was a prank. I don't know. I exchanged a sort of tweet or two with her, and I said, yes, this is, you know, this is something that I call symbolic distortion. It's not exactly, you know, you didn't walk out your door and see a hedgehog and pick it up out of the road, but the first thing you saw had to do with, you know, keeping hedgehogs safe, protecting them, which you did in the dream. And while many precognitive dreams will give you exact one-to-one correlation, it will be exactly what happens. Oftentimes there's this symbolic distortion, which is understandable because dreams speak a symbolic language. So that's why I decided to finally write this book. And she's right, it does happen. And the statistics are in. The statistical evidence for precognition, not only in dreams, but in waking states as well. It's been in for a long time, but it's even more in. It's sort of more and more difficult to ignore it. A very good book about that is by Dean Radin. It's called Real Magic, and he's, you know, one of the leading scientists working on parapsychology and especially precognition. And I won't go into it. I mentioned it in the book, all the stats and that kind of stuff. I mean, you know, after a few accounts, you realize, yes, it's there. So you don't need to be convinced anymore, but it's there. And it's the sort of thing, if it was statistical evidence about something, you know, the mating habits of albino rats, as Colin Wilson said a long time ago, or whatever, the strange behavior of certain kind of particles, nobody would be arguing about it. But the fact that it's about precognition is something that, you know, it's always had difficulty getting accepted. And I have this here because this was a photo from a newspaper article about the precog economy. So in areas that are, you know, how should we say it, where things have to work even more than they have to do in science, or you just have to experimentally work somewhere. But no, like in the economy, you either make money from it or you don't. And also in the military, I don't have that here too. We all know there's a whole kind of precog military too. So it's taken seriously. So I you know, I don't really argue the point. It's just there. And the thing is, like, it's one of these things that we kind of come to accept when it really should, like, stop us in our tracks. So how I got into realizing that I dream the future is way back in 1980. I read a book called An Experiment with Time. This is written by this fellow, J.W. Dunne. And Dunne wasn't an occultist. He wasn't interested in the occult. Oh, he says that in the first book. Later on in the book he wrote, he didn't finish writing. I think it was called Intrusions. Towards the end of his life, he tells a different story where he was interested in spiritualism and all that sort of thing. So subsequent confession about his own interests may make his sort of, no, I had no interest in this kind of thing now seem a bit, you know, sort of dodgy. But the way he presented in the book is that he's an aeronautics engineer. That's what he is. He's in math, making things fly and all that. Just by chance, he realized that he dreamed the future. And what had happened was that he had a dream that he was arguing with someone about the time. And in the dream, Dunne said to, you know, the dream person he was arguing with that it was 4:30, you know, 3:30 in the morning. And the guy said, no, it wasn't. And Dunne said, yes, it was, and I'll show you. And he pulls out his pocket watch and shows him, and it's on the pocket watch, it's 4:30. I couldn't find one that said 4:30, so just imagine. And then in actual real life, real time, Dunne woke up in his bed and he said, oh, that was an odd dream. And gee, I wonder what time it really is. So he got up and he pulled his pocket watch out of his trousers and he put the light on with a candle. This is actually around the turn of the century when this happened, turn of the 19th into the 20th. Almost 100 years ago that the book came out. And he looked and it's, oh, it was 4:30 on his watch. So he assumed that, he didn't know whether that was the right time or not, on the watch. He assumed that the watch had stopped earlier in the day. Somehow he noticed it. He forgot to wind it. And this nagging sense of having forgotten to wind the watch was the reason why he had that dream. And this is a kind of very cause and effect way of understanding dreams. This happened to me, and so I had that dream. But so he wound the watch, put it back, went back to sleep. And when he woke up, he figured that I'd have to see what time it really was and fix the watch. But then when he woke up, he saw the watch actually was the correct time. So in the dream, it was 4:30. In real time, it was 4:30. So somehow he dreamt that he was going to see, his watch being 4:30 a few seconds before he did. And then he started to have all these other sorts of dreams. There's the most famous one, or at least the one that was like the most stupendous. And these are the kind of future dreams we usually hear about, these sort of disaster ones. And I talk about a couple of those in the book. Aberfan in the 1960s is the most famous, and more recently 9/11. There's quite a few precognitive events around that, and so on and so on. But in Dunne's case, he dreamt that he was on an island, and he saw the cracks and fissures opening up and steam escaping from him. And he knew there was going to be a volcanic explosion and the island was going to be destroyed. And he had to get the French authorities, because they were the ones, running the place, to understand what was happening so that they could evacuate the 4,000 people and all this sort of thing. And it was only a bit of time after he had that dream that he realized what had happened was that the dream was about the eruption of Mount Pelée on the island of Martinique, which I think was around 1904, around that time. And the strange thing was that Dunne realized that when he subsequently read the newspaper reports about it, it wasn't 4,000 people, it was 40,000. But in the dream, he'd misread the newspaper headline. And he came to see that his future dreams, he wasn't like raised up above a kind of, like if you take a plane or a balloon, in the old days, a hot air balloon, you go up above and you can see the landscape around you in all directions. It wasn't like he saw time or the future in general. He saw his own personal future, what he was going to see, what he was going to read in the newspaper, what he might see in a book, something he might see on the street or whatever. And there's many, many examples of that. And it's still an interesting book to read. Just for that. And he develops a whole philosophy called serialism, which had quite a vogue in the sort of 20s and 30s and 40s for a while. People like J.B. Priestley, who I'll get on to, but also H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells knew Dunne. And one of his later novels, The Shape of Things to Come, it's a time travel novel, but not in the sense of the time machine, where there's a machine, that takes the time traveler into the future and the past. In Shape of Things to Come, the character, the protagonist, insofar as there is one, his name is Philip Raven, and he's read Dunne's book, and he's kept a record of his dreams. And what he has been able to do is to see the future like centuries in advance and all that. So it's a take on that, but it's a different take on time travel in the sense that it's a mental time travel, not a physical one that Wells did in the early book. So what I did at this point, around 42 years ago by now, was exactly what I said at the talk, and what the woman who saved the hedgehogs did, was that I started writing down my dreams. And so my own experiment with time, conducted over 40 years, more than that, began in 1980. And I was interested in this stuff even earlier than that. This is back in the day when I was a musician and I was playing in Blondie, and I was living on the Bowery in New York in 1975. That's when I started reading about all the stuff I'm writing about now. And it was mostly one book, I'll get onto it, Colin Wilson's book, The Occult. He talks about a variety of different kind of time slips and time anomalies and all that. That got me sort of going on all the kind of thing I do now many years later. But one of the things that came out of that was I started reading everything I could about the paranormal and magic and occult and all that. And it was a boom time for that because all the bookshops had lots and lots of sort of public domain reprints of classics. So at cheap, unheard of today, but it was wonderful at the time. So I was reading all this stuff. And my girlfriend at the time got interested in it too. And then when I was on the first US tour with Blondie, we were opening for Iggy Pop. My girlfriend and I, we started having these strange experiences where we seemed to have the same kind of dream, or we wind up trying to call each other at the same time. And this was this was before cell phones and mobile phones and all that. So you had to, coordinate where you were in the hotel and, phone booth and all this sort of thing. And out of that came the song "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence Dear," which was a big hit longer ago than I care to admit. But it was about these shared experiences of dream and kind of telepathy and so on and so on. And then out of that interest, I wound up reading Dunne's book, and I started recording my dreams. And very soon into doing it, it happened. So the first future dream I recorded was I dreamt that I was playing a red guitar. I didn't have one. I didn't know anybody who had one. I was a musician at the time, and I was walking around New York with a friend, and he bumped into a friend, and we went to somebody else's place. I didn't know the person. Sat down, and he said, "Here, check this out," and handed me a red guitar. Might have been a Fender, I don't remember. And I started strumming, and I realized, oh God, this is the dream. I'm playing this red guitar. That was strange enough. And then the next dream I had, that's not me. But I did look quite different back then, but no, that isn't me. The next dream I had was like, I dreamt about being in an intimate setting with this woman that I didn't know. I wanted to, and very much would have liked to have been intimate with her. And again, through a series of chance events, that's what happened. So I soon into it started realizing, like, this really happens. And so years later, I saw that's like 80, 81 and all that time. And throughout the 80s, and I started, I just kept these dream journals, many of them. And when I got in touch with my publisher and said, I'd like to write about this, and they said, okay, fine, they commissioned me. I pulled these dream journals out that I've been carrying around for years. I mean, I've shipped them out from the States. I've lived here for a long time, but I've been carrying them around forever. And also ones that I've, collected while living here. Dusted them off and went through them and was pulling out, ones that struck me as the most kind of convincing. And there's many in the book. I mean, there's just like pages. In fact, it's kind of an embarrassment of riches because it's just there's so many. And they can happen years in advance. There's a couple here that is, this one is. And others happen the next day or even 5 minutes later as soon as you wake up. It's all different. And I don't know why I happen to be someone who, there's quite a few of them. I make no claim to any superpower about this whatsoever. It's just been the case. But the shadow Dracula and my past life as a Tibetan monk. Well, many of the future dreams I've had, what they call Dunne type dreams, or you dream in advance something that's happening to you. It's what's going to happen to you in particular. You're not making a prediction. It's not a prophecy. It's not a premonition. You don't even know. This is the thing. I never wake up knowing that I've had a future dream. It's only later that day or the next day or something that I realize, oh God, that was in the dream. So it's not like that. It isn't like waking up and knowing, oh my God, I have to call whatever my old friend and tell him not to take that flight. It's not like that. But the most convincing one for me, and the one that I just feel nails it, although all of them nail it for me, was in 1990. I was living in Los Angeles, and I dreamed 4 years in advance two specific scenes from the 1994 film, The Shadow, starring Alec Baldwin, and the plot of the film as well. And in 1990, I had this dream, and the two specific scenes, there's a scene, if you know, The Shadow is this old pulp figure, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men, the Shadow knows. And he had the power to cloud men's minds. And it's strange that I bring in Tibet here because, he learned this in Tibet, his years in Tibet, he learned the power to cloud men's minds. But in the film, and if you haven't seen the film, it's really worth seeing. It was like a jump on all the superhero films that are the rage, these days. There's a scene where the shadow is a two-dimensional figure on a wall, and then he steps out. It becomes 3D. And there's another scene in which he has one of his trademark 45s. It's just the gun, and it's like a hall of mirrors, like old crystals around him, and refractions of that image. And I dreamed those two scenes, but also I dreamed the plot, and the plot surrounds something called a beryllium sphere. There's some evil madman who wants to blow New York, blow up New York, and they using a beryllium sphere. It's got some kind of nuclear, early 20th century sort of thing, gizmo. But that was like well in advance. And then another that was not so many years, that's 4 years, much more closer in time, was the opening scene of Coppola's Dracula. Again, that's, I don't know, that's early 90s or something like that. And my wife at the time, well, I affectionately refer to her as my future ex-wife. And she's in the book quite a bit, because many dreams. I mean, that's the other thing too, everybody's couples, we all know this happens. And she and I share dreams, or dreams like, was this telepathic? Was this future? I don't know. And many of them are in there, and I'll get on to one or two with any luck. But she was working for Sony Studios at the time, and she was working on that film, Dracula. And we were invited to a special screening, and was all hush hush. And she didn't talk to me about it at all. And well in advance of, like a couple of weeks in advance, I dreamed the opening scene. If you remember, it's Vlad the Impaler, and he's, just hacking away, and it's like a charnel house. And I wrote down that it was like one of Swedenborg's hells. And if you know Swedenborg's account of hell, it's a pretty nasty place and all that. And this one here, this is when I worked at a metaphysical bookshop, much like Watkins, in Los Angeles, called the Bodhi Tree, which isn't there anymore, sadly, but it was, a classic place, was there for many years. And when I was working there, I dreamt one night that I was with the group of Tibetan monks, and we had this kind of ball of yarn, and they were tossing it. We were all in a circle, and we were tossing it to each other, and it started opening up. And as it opened up, it turned into a big kind of mandala. And we all had a bit of it. We were sort of walking, dancing around with it. If you think like a trampoline, or if you're catching somebody, jumping from a building. So we had it, and just opened up, and we're all like laughing, and, it was wonderful kind of thing. And then the next day when I went into the bookshop, first thing I walked in before one of my colleagues said, "Oh, Gary, we found this photo of you in a past life." And I said, "Was it in Tibet?" And he said, "Yeah." And it's a photo in Alexander David-Néel's book, Initiates and Initiation in Tibet. And I can't see him there, but there's a slight chubby looking guy back there with the sort of round glasses. So that was like, I dreamt that night, and then that day at work that happened. So there's so many of them. I mentioned my future ex-wife, just to go quickly. One night, one day, I was living in Camden Town. I walked into a bookshop there at Old Waterstones, and I was in the back of the shop, and I saw her walk in the front. And I cowardly didn't want to see her, so I sort of hid whatever, and didn't let her know I was there. And then she left. And that night, I dreamt that I was walking along Parkway, which, well, this is Camden High Street. Parkway's around there. And behind me, someone called my name, and it was my ex-wife. So I chalked that up to guilt. All right. So I was cowardly avoided her, and so my unconscious punished me with this dream. But the next evening, I was walking along Parkway. I was going to a lecture at the Temenos Academy, which had its meetings there around at that time. And just as in the dream, behind me, somebody called my name, and it was my ex-wife, and she was on her way to the event as well. And then more recently, when I was looking through my dream journals, I said, for precognitive dreams to use in this book, during the beginning of COVID, I came across a dream from 1998 where someone tells me, stay at home. There's no need to go out. Stay at home where it's safe. And that was what you heard everywhere, on the media all around you. Okay, so that was was that a coincidence? Was that a synchronicity? And then they even happen in waking life. Again, not as many as the dreams, but this one, this is Beethoven. And some years ago, not that long ago, but some years ago, I was sort of not napping, but kind of, and I wanted to hear Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. I was listening to Radio 3, BBC Radio 3, and I thought, oh gee, I want to hear the Pastoral Symphony. So I was going to get up and put the CD on, but I said, no, wait, let me hear what the announcer plays, the DJ plays. And the next thing they played was Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. So synchronicity, precognition, they're very close. I mean, Jung used synchronicity as a kind of all-purpose thing, but synchronicity is meaningful coincidence. And again, I have many of them in the book. Here are two recent ones. Just before COVID, again, I was on my way to give a talk about Colin Wilson, I mentioned already, and his first book, The Outsider, his most famous book, and to the Theosophical Society here in London, down towards Baker Street way. And on my way, I passed the local market and I thought, oh God, there's something I need. Let me just pop in now, I'll get it, because I'll forget. And so random, I just went in. And when I was in the queue to check out, I looked over at the, the magazine rack, and the magazines were, arranged so that all I could see on the cover of Vogue was The Outsider. That's what I was about to go talk about, okay? Now, strange, okay. Coming back, I realized, oh, there's something else I needed. I went back in and I thought, let me go look at that magazine to see exactly what it was about, because it couldn't have been about the book. I later discovered it was about the singer Billie Eilish. I don't know anything about. But the magazines weren't there. They had changed them. They brought the new issues in. So if I didn't walk in when I did, I wouldn't have seen that. If I didn't walk in on my way to talk about The Outsider, I wouldn't have seen The Outsider. And then more recently, one of the first live talks I've given, strangely enough, was at another cemetery, Kensal Rise. And I was giving a talk about a literary history of hell. And as I was walking down the tube to get there, the very first thing I saw on one of the adverts in the tube, the moving ones that go up and down, was Hell Yes, Hell Bunny, and if you have it, haunt it. So I may be, so where are we? How much I got? About another maybe 10 minutes or so. I'll try to get through this quickly. So some of the people I talk about, one of them is Arthur Koestler. Again, he's not read as much these days. He was very well known in the 20th century, very political writer. Then he moved on to writing about sort of creativity and psychology. And he became very interested in things like synchronicity and coincidence. And he did a famous book called The Roots of Coincidence. And this was, again, early 70s. This was a time when this sort of stuff was being taken seriously by mainstream people. So it was a different time today where most of the mainstream goes out of its way to say it's all rubbish. But Koestler, he collected coincidences. He was a collector of coincidences, and they happened to him. And some of the most remarkable ones he drew on that were collected by the French scientist and philosopher Camille Flammarion, a very, very respected, prestigious figure in his day, who was openly interested in all this sort of stuff, and no embarrassment about it. But he tells the remarkable story of Monsieur Fontgibu and the plum pudding. It's you have to read it to get the full effect. But basically, there's a poet named Émile Deschamps, and when he was a young boy, he was in a situation where he was offered a slice of a plum pudding, and this was something that was very, very strange and exotic in France. So I mean, they're just Christmas puddings here, but in France, in that day, the 19th century, was an odd thing, and you didn't see it; it wasn't around anywhere. So on the first occasion he ever has plum pudding, this man, Monsieur Fontgibu, is there and offering it to him, and that sort of thing. Then years later, he's in Paris. And he's walking along, some boulevard somewhere, and he passes a cafe or a brasserie, and he sees, advertised plum pudding. Says, I have not had plum pudding since that time at Monsieur Fontgibu, so many years ago. And he goes in and he orders it, and they say, Monsieur, je suis désolé, the last slice of plum pudding has been sold. But let me see. And they go over and they ask the gentleman who's ordered it if he would be happy to share some. And who is it? Monsieur Fontgebel. Okay, so the second time this guy ever wants to have plum pudding, it's also Monsieur Fontgebel there. So one more time, Emile Deschamps, years later again, is invited to a party somewhere in Paris, a dinner party, at which plum pudding is going to be served. And he's sitting down at the table with all the people, and he's about to regale them with his story of Monsieur Fontgebel. And he says, well, you know, that time, the second time, now I'm having it, and all we need now is for Monsieur Fontgebel to turn up. And as he says that, there's a knock at the door, and who is it? Monsieur Fontgebel. Why is he there? He too was invited to a dinner party, but not at that flat, at a different flat, but he got the number wrong and knocked on the wrong, you know, door. So there's all that stuff. I mean, I can only touch on, I mean, this stuff, Floriline here, fragrant Floriline was like a tooth powder. And there's a remarkable story about William Morris, you know, the arts and craft artist and writer in the late 19th century. And he was on an expedition, like up to the north, at the top of my head, I forget exactly where. But he and his crew had ordered all this material that they needed. And it was all going to be packed into these, you know, sort of crates that would not be opened until they got to their destination. And they got an announcement from whoever was, I think it was Fortnum and Mason or something like that, was supplying the stuff. And they said, oh, we've made a mistake and we packed in some things that should go to somebody else in with your crates, blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, why don't you have to come here and open them up. We're not going to open them themselves. If you want to come and get it and take it out. So Fortnum and Mason never showed up. So they went in the expedition, and along the way, the people on the expedition started sort of wondering what could it be? What was the stuff that they, you know, the mistaken order, what got mixed in with their stuff? And they all kind of, you know, stupidly guessed about stuff. But William Morris said it was, oh yeah, so it was a batch of fragrant Floriline and sort of flowers and this kind of thing. And long story short, at the end, when they finally get where they had to go, they opened the crates, looked in the stuff that wasn't theirs, and what was it but fragrant Floriline? So it's sort of, why would he, you know, and it was exactly, you know, what he said, you know, and it was actually packed in a kind of wrapping paper that had flowers on it. So it had flowers there too. So, I mean, there's many weird coincidences, you know. I mean, one of my own coincidences I mentioned was that when I'm a couple of years back, a group of friends, we all met at an Indian restaurant for dinner, and we got the check. It was for 123 pounds and 45p. So it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, so that's strange and doesn't happen. It's funny, but there's no particular meaning behind it. You know, but they you know, there's many others like that. And I have Rebecca West here because one of the how should we say it? Positive kind of coincidences. I mean, these are just strange, and that's the difference between, you know, this is what Kessler means by the cosmic joker and the inkfish effect. I mean, Kessler has this notion that in some of these things, there's some kind of integrative tendency at work, you know, and there's different people he touched on that goes into this, and I mentioned them there, that pulls like things together. But then sometimes the things are just so strange and weird that it's just like some cosmic joker saying, you know, how do you like that? But the integrative tendency can be exemplified by someone like Rebecca West, the writer Rebecca West, and she talks about the library angel. And she says when she was in the London Library and she was trying to research the Nuremberg trials, and she discovered they were ordered in some ridiculous kind of way that made it impossible to find anything. And she was trying to find, you know, some particular trials, and she couldn't find them. And she, you know, stopped the librarian and said, you know, look, I have no idea how I can find this. There's no way of looking at it. It's not really alphabetical. It's not chronological. It could be anywhere. And she went up and grabbed some, you know, one of the files off the shelf and pulled it down and opened it up. And lo and behold, it was exactly what she wanted. So the library angel is this remarkable research assistant who hands you what you want. And there's so many different, you know, any writer, you know, anybody who researches knows that. Okay, so I mentioned Priestley. Priestley read Dunne. He was very interested in Dunne's ideas. He didn't like serialism. Serialism is a strange, endless kind of philosophy in the sense where you have to keep positing different times. So for Dunne to explain the fact that he could see the future, his dreams, he said, well, there's time one, which is everyday, logical waking time. And it's you and I, a waking conscious ego, and we're kind of stuck to the present, and we're moving into the future 1 second at a time. But when we go to sleep, that kind of restriction loosens, and we can rise up a bit, and we can see this kind of, it's like a film script. We can see. That's why the future dreams are mixed in with lots of other things. You have to pay attention. You have to write them down, and you have to pay attention to what happens. Don't look for stuff, but just pay attention to what happens to you, because it's all mixed in. We're not talking about bum, yes, there'll be this tomorrow, or, you'll win at the Derby. There's many of those, there are those ones, but those are far and few between, really. The kinds of future dreams you can figure out that you have all the time will be about mundane things. The only thing interesting about them is that they're pictures, they're images from the future. All right, but Dunne kept, there's observer one, then time one, and observer two, and time two, and time three, and time four, and it just kept going in this, what in philosophy is known as the horror of infinite regress. You never, you always have to pause it. And again, I wax philosophically in the book about time, a bit, and it is one of those things. Once you get going on it, we think we know what it is, but once you start thinking about it, it slips through your fingers. I mean, St. Augustine had the great one-liner about time. When someone asked him, "What is time?" he said, "If you don't ask the question, I know the answer." So we know it intuitively, but if we try to explicitly, logically say what time is, it's gone. The present doesn't really exist. The present is this non-existent membrane between the past and the future, and it's gone already, and all that sort of thing. We talk about time flowing, but where are the banks of time? If time's a river, where is it bank, or the banks? There's no banks, the river time. Does it really flow? So I touch on those metaphysical questions in there, but Priestley was somebody also who was fascinated with those kind of questions. That's why he was interested in Dunne's work, and he wrote very, very successful plays. He did a hat trick quite, more than once on the West End, with having 3 of his plays going at the same time, and often it was the time plays, where he talks about being able to see the future. But he was also influenced by Peter Uspensky, who's most known as Gurdjieff's most brilliant expositor, but he was a remarkable philosopher and writer in his own right. And Uspensky had many interesting ideas about time, one of which was eternal recurrence, the notion that our lives repeat over and over and over again, which is something you find in Nietzsche, but also that time was 6 dimensions. There's a 4th dimension of kind of just straight, tick-tock time. 5th dimension is recurrence, and the 6th dimension is some strange dimension in which we can actually change things. We can actually change the future. And this was something that Priestley talks about in this late book of his, Over the Long High Wall, some reflections on life, death, and time, where he tells a story of a woman who, in a dream, she dreams she's camping, and she takes her baby to the stream. She has to wash some things, and she realizes she's forgotten the soap. So she puts the baby down. The tents are very close. She walks back to the tent to get the soap, but by the time she comes back, this is in the dream, by the time she comes back, the baby's tumbled over into the stream and is drowned. So sometime later, she actually is camping. She finds herself by the stream with the baby. She needs to wash some things. She realizes she's forgotten the soap. She remembers the dream. So instead of leaving the baby, she takes it with her, takes it back to the tent, brings it back, and all is well. So she had a glimpse of the future, which we could consider to be, predestined in some way, irrevocable. But she was able, some way, because she had this in advance, to rise up above it and to alter it. So Priestley argues for, an element of free will in all this. And if you ever get a chance, I mean, it was written a long time ago, but it's still a remarkable read. His book, Man in Time. And someone else that I talk about in the book is T.C. Lethbridge, who again is someone who's not read as much these days. He's most known for his work on the pendulum, but he wrote quite a few books in the late 60s. He died in the early 70s. Colin Wilson wrote about him in his big book Mysteries, several chapters, kind of mini book about Lethbridge himself. But Lethbridge was asked late in life to do a book about dreams, and he did. And he too discovered that, oh, I dream the future. He talks about in a dream seeing someone. He thought it was somebody shaving, a man shaving, because he saw his hands in front of his face, and it was like a glass there that was a reflection and all that. But what it actually was he was driving around in Devon, I forget where he lived, and he turned a corner, and the oncoming car to him, and he saw the person the man driving the car, his hands on the the steering wheel, and the glass, the windshield was sort of the reflection of the mirror. And in his experiments with pendulum, which I can't go into, but I go into in the book, I mean, they're fascinating in themselves. But Lethbridge came to the understanding that there was a realm beyond our, everyday tick-tock time, 1 second after the other. There's a kind of realm where a kind of eternal now, we can say. And this was the realm in which one can, see dreams. So he started recording his future dreams, but he did a kind of classification of dreams. And one of the strange dreams that he has, and I found this on YouTube, our cat walking backwards, that he had this dream that it was a dream of his cat, but it was the cat being backwards. So it wasn't actually the cat walking backwards, but it was actually the cat walking into his room, but he saw it backwards, as if a film being played backwards in some strange way. So he joined the ranks of the other time-haunted men. And one of the last things, I think if I just get these in the next two minutes here, are when I talk about time slips, where we're talking about going into the future, but there's also these remarkable experiences of people going into the past. Not necessarily in the dreams, which that can happen as well. If your dreams can evoke the past in remarkable kind of lucidity and kind of vitalness. They're transformative experiences sometimes when you have those dreams. But in the early 20th century, there's a book called An Adventure by these two women, Moberly and Jourdain, and they were two sort of Oxford ladies, and they visited Versailles. And they had this remarkable experience where they believed that they had been sent back to the time of Marie Antoinette. And they wrote this adventure, and subsequently different people investigated it and they tried to disprove it, but actually it's not ever actually been technically disproved. And people who lived nearby, I guess overlooking Versailles in some way, said that yes, they often seen these characters walking around. So people in the dress of that period of Marie Antoinette, and they encountered parts of the Trianon garden that were there at that time, but later on were no longer there and been demolished and things of that sort. So, okay, you might think a couple dotty, ladies, Mrs. Marple go over, or Miss Marples go over there and have a strange experience, but how you can't discount someone like Arnold Toynbee, who's again great 20th century historian, wrote this remarkable multi-volume work just called The Study of History. But he, in one of the volumes, he says how he came to write this study of history, this vision of civilizations, different civilizations rise and fall, and what's involved in their civilization, the rise and fall. He talks about when he was in Greece, Sparta, up towards I guess it's Macedonia these days, that sort of way, and he was visiting the site of Mistra, which was a very, very famous and important place throughout much of Western history until the 1820s, around then, when during an uprising, it was overrun by these Highlanders and they just destroyed the place and it had been left a ruin. And I guess he's there in the early 20th century, so it's not quite 100 years later, but long enough. And while he was there overlooking the plain of Sparta, he suddenly felt that he had been plunged back to that battle, that massacre. He knew it had happened. He knew the history, but somehow, he was in a relaxed state of mind. He sunk into an imaginative grasp where he really knew, and he saw it all around him. And then Toynbee records several other time slips where he's sent back to, with the Spaniards first going into South America, or he's sent with the first Crusades to Constantinople, with the Crusaders sacked the city there. And then he tells this one remarkable experience where he's walking in front of Victoria Station and he has a vision of all history parading before him. And this was the kind of thing, when I first read about this ages ago in Colin Wilson's book, The Occult, he talked about this, and he called it Faculty X. And this was it's Faculty X because we don't have a name for it. but it's the ability to grasp the reality of other times and places, not just the fact. We know the fact that this happened. We know the fact that whatever, something happened in the past, but it's the reality of it, the whole 3D, HD, VR, complete kind of sense around experience of it, which is something that it's a potential of our consciousness, and it happens to us, and these experiences of Toynbee are kind of larger scale experiences of it that happen to us another way. And one of the ones in literature, one of the ones that Wilson points to is Proust at the beginning of his novel Remembrance of Things Past. Proust, Marcel in the book, he tastes the Madeleine, this lovely little cake dipped in the tisane, it's a herbal tea, and reminds him, what is this? What is this? What is this? And he can't remember what it is. And suddenly he remembers when he was young, he used to go on holiday, Cambrai, that's in the north of France, I think it's Normandy, and his aunt or grandmother used to give him a taste of her cake dipped in the tisane. And he knew that that's what he did. He knew they went back there, but suddenly it all came back in full sense around kind of experience. And Wilson connects this later on in later writings and Toynbee sort of experience and other sort of time slips with the paranormal faculty of psychometry, which is the ability, you can touch something and you can know its history. And so in general, it's like there's an information universe, and we can check into it. So just very quickly, I talk in the book a couple of my own sort of moments at a time. And I can only, where I slipped from the usual tick-tock time, which we're kind of this rushing sense, like got to get things done, got to, left brain, manic, kind of practical utilitarian thing. And we have to take, inebriants of various kinds in order to slow down, but we can do it on our own without those. And one happened to me many, many years ago when I was walking along the coast path, the Cornwall coast path, ages ago. Actually, this is part of this pilgrimage I made down to Wilson to see Wilson, because that he lived down there. Well, he didn't until he died some years ago. His Joy, his widow, is still down there. And on this pilgrimage, part of it, I walked the coast path, and at one point I just found myself near this kind of shallow pool of water, looking at these stones, and they just were glistening in the sun. And to this day, I can't remember how long I sat there, but I just became completely kind of desynchronized with the sort of usual, time you have to keep moving sort of thing. And we could say, and I talk about it a bit in the book, it went from a manic kind of left brain, practical, let's get things done sensibility, to a right brain, which is just sort of there in the moment. And if you want to have a handy distinction between the two, you can say the left takes care of business and the right takes care of isness. Just the sheer fact that things exist. And then another time, some years later, when I was living in Los Angeles, and I went up to the Sequoias and chill out and rented a cabin. But it took me 3 days to actually leave the city behind. Even with my best intentions, I could not really relax, and so I was unconsciously, sort of, tied into this robotic kind of ever surging kind of, left brain tick-tock kind of time. And it took a while. And the reason I emphasize the 3 days, because I talk about Edward T. Hall, a remarkable book, The Dance of Life. And he talks about his experiences with the Hopi Indians, and where he was like on saddleback passing through land, and we had to slow down. And he actually experienced, we can change our own time. Time, it's not something that's out there. I mean, there's tick-tock time, there's the clock time, there's measured time, but our experience of time is subjective, and we actually have more control over it. That's one of the things I try to say in the book. But after the third day, when I could actually relax, I just found myself wandering through the sequoias, these trees that are thousands of years old. And it was, again, that loss of that sense of having to do anything in particular, and just being able to appreciate, just, as we say, being in the moment. But another strange experience I talk about was a kind of faculty X experience, and I talk about others in some, like Priestley's and some other people, where when I was living in New York, again, this is sort of it's around the time when I was first reading Dunne, around 1980, and been out for a walk with some friends. We came back to my flat, and I had a globe at that time. And the globe was positioned that when you walked into the flat, it was one of the first things you saw. And I don't know what happened, but again, it's down over that way. But I walked in and I saw India on the globe, and it was as if I was transposed suddenly, sent up into space, up above the subcontinent, and could see it spatially stretched out below me, so whatever, 1,000 miles up above, but also its history. I mean, I know nothing about it. I know a bit more now, but at the time I knew nothing, about it at all. But suddenly I just saw this kind of parade of, pageantry and battles and migrations and all this sort of thing you might see in a kind of montage, a documentary sort of thing. And it all happened in a few seconds. And there are other experiences like that in there. So I think with that, I have to say, now we are out of time. Yeah, so thank you very much. Well, as I said, it is very common. It's it's the sort of thing that we've known for ages that this takes place. And the distinction I make is that I never wake up knowing that, oh, this is going to happen. I haven't had any of those kinds of dreams. But it's the sort of thing like I subsequently discovered that, oh my God, I dreamt that. So I'm again, I've been recording them now. So, but it's, I mean, there are people who have that. I mean, anytime I've mentioned this with any friends, they always have a story like that, or they know someone has a story like that. So no, this is just part of human. This is something that one wants to say, before we were civilized, we probably had a much closer bond, internally, a participatory shared consciousness. And then over time, we've kind of inhibited that because we've developed other means to communicate, telephones and things like that. But if you pay attention, and some people are more sensitive to it, and it just happens. So no, thank you for sharing that. That's the thing. I'm more of a natural historian. I just like pay attention to it and see if it happens. So I am convinced. I mean, it's there's an intelligence at work in some way in dreams in the first place. And I say in the book, I've come to think of there's a who rather than a what involved with dreams in some way, but not a not a personality in the same way that an ego who that I am, but it's some intelligence. So, but no, and this is a kind of thing with lucid dreams. I mean, you can develop lucid dreams or lucidity where you're awake in the dream, you're in the dream, you can change the dream, you can make things happen and all that. And there's a lot you can do with that, and there's a lot of books about that. But in a way, I kind of follow Jung with saying the dream is a natural kind of expression, and it's not you in the sense that it's not your ego, it's what you're unconscious of. So it's kind of, that's why they're hard for us to understand ourselves. That's why usually somebody else can say, yeah, I wonder if that's what that means. And we don't see it immediately because this is exactly what we are unconscious of. And if you're sort of using dreams for utilitarian reasons, even for the best reasons, self-development and all that, it may interfere with that. So I don't know, but no, the only intention I go to sleep with is that, let me remember the dreams. But I go through patches where I remember them quite a bit, and they're very long, and other times I just bits and pieces, and times I don't remember them at all. Well, I tell you, one of the things I also noticed that if you ever hear a tune in your head, so you find yourself, you're humming it, and you realize, ooh, think about what's going on, whatever you're just involved in at the time. And oftentimes the tune is a reflection on what's happening. I remember once, there was somebody I just didn't really want to see them anymore and all that. And then I found myself humming the old Janician song, I can't see you anymore, baby. And I didn't think of that, but it just came to me. I thought, oh, and it's like right brain, whatever the other, George or Edgar or whoever you want to name that other part of you, because you are your left brain. The verbal you uses language and associates with I, the ego. That's your left brain. The other brain uses symbols and imagery and music and all this kind of stuff to communicate. And you have to, it's subtle, and you sort of have to be aware of it. But I mean, that's something that, you know, I find often, and I'm attuned to that now. And I sometimes think, okay, and it's very helpful if you can remember, if you can pay attention to the song that's going through your head when there's some kind of, whatever it might be, some situation, you know, should I do this? Should I not do it? Or that kind of thing. It's a helpful hint. I'm sorry, just say one of the strange coincidences in the book, or precognitive things, I just very quickly, some years ago, I was on holiday in Ticino, which is the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. And on the way there, the old Kink song, I'm dating myself, but you know, I have a few years on me. Party Line, which is 1960s, if you know it or not, was in my head. The entire, you know, trip down to where we were going, I don't know why, it just was there for no reason. When we got to this place we were staying at, they actually had a phone booth in the flat, in the house. And this was, you know, mobile phones were happening then. But just for fun, I went in and picked up the, you know, the receiver and put it to my head, and I heard voices. And a party line is when more than one, you know, person uses the phone line. So on the way to this place, I kept hearing that song, and I picked up the phone, and it was indeed a party line. But it was just like, that's the Inkfish effect. What am I supposed to make of that? So, in any case. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess, you know, yes, our psyches are porous and permeable. So you might just have to learn to live with it and maybe not pay attention in some way. I mean, I mean, back in the day, you probably could have been, you know, found a nice spot for yourself at court, because the king might have said, "Ah, is this true? You know what they say," and you'd be able to, you know, do that. But maybe, you know, maybe you have a good career in therapy too. You know, I mean, not getting it, but actually being the therapist. Not well. What I have found was that if I wake up, say early, you know, whatever 4 or something, which, you know, and then go back to sleep for a bit, that sort of shallow sleep, or maybe even, you know, maybe go back to sleep for an hour, you know, but you wake up at 6. I tend to get up at 7, so you wake at 6, go back to sleep for an hour or so. In that shallow sleep, often there'll be some precognitive elements. It's different sorts of things. It's a funny thing. I mean, I can't fall asleep on my back at night because I slip into sleep paralysis, which is something that we all do, because when we dream, our muscles go limp and torpid so that we don't, you know, act out the dream. This is an evolutionary adaptive strategy, which tells us that dreaming was so important that evolution had to come up with something to ensure that we would be able to dream. Because because yes, if you're flapping around, I mean, this is way, you know, before we're humans, but if you're flapping around and a predator can hear you and get you, you have 2 choices. You could either stop the dreaming, which is making you flap around, or stop yourself from flapping around. All right. So what did evolution do? Let's keep the dreaming, and let's come up with some way to stop you from kind of, you know, moving around. So that's sleep paralysis. That happens to me if I fall asleep at night on my back. I can take a nap on my back during the day, and that often I'll slip into a hypnagogic state on the way, and then, you know, but I don't try to have them. I notice that they happen. So this is like, I'm trying to keep it like that so that, yeah, I just noticed this. So I guess I'm trying to be scientist in this way. But I mean, there's a book called Liminal Dreaming by a friend of mine, Jennifer Dumford, and she has all different kind of, you know, advice or suggestions, you know, herbs and incenses and things of that sort to sort of aid dreaming and change it and all that. So I mean, you might look into that kind of thing. My book, obviously. But I mean, after that, you can follow those leads. I mean, that's what I've done. I mean, I just follow the leads, you know. I mean, that's why Colin Wilson, I mean, he's remarkable for that. He's just read so much. He talks about it so intelligently, and you know, I want to say page turningly, which is horrible, but you know, And you just follow that. And I mean, the thing with Dunne, I mean, you don't have to understand serialism. So in a way, Experiment in Time is the one to read, and all the others because he doesn't really care about the dreams themselves. They just were a way for him to see the strange character of time. I tell you, I mean, if you ever get a chance, I mean, J.B. Priestley's, they're autobiographical, but they're actually not quite, you can't quite classify them, but these books he wrote in the 30s called there's Rain Upon God's Hill, and there's Midnight in the Desert. And they're about him, his experience. They're very readable, but in them he has accounts of his dream experiences and his reflections on Ouspensky's ideas about time, and things of that sort. I mean, there's just, you know, it's things will come to you. I mean, I'm sure they have already once you start. But I mean, I mean, Kessler's Roots of Coincidence, it's an easy read. It's a short book too. And another interesting book with Kessler is one called The Case of the Midwife Toad, which is about it's a sort of intellectual detective story about this Austrian biologist Paul Kammerer, who the midwife toad is the experiments he did with a toad to actually prove Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics, which Darwinians say is impossible. And there's all controversy about, you know, fakery and fraudulent and all that, and he wound up committing suicide. But he was a collector of coincidences, and he developed something, he called it seriality, which is not the same thing as serialism. It meant that like things happen together. They either happen in a sequence or simultaneously. And he spent many hours in Vienna in the parks and cafes and on the trolleys and all that, just, you know, what people were reading, where they were going, you know, what they were eating, just all these kinds of coincidences. And he came to the conclusion that there is this kind of cosmic law that pulls like things together. And he would consider it just a scientific law like gravity, but it is very much like the ancient, you know, sympathy of all things, you know, the Hermetic correspondences where like attracts like and all that kind of thing. And so, yeah, you do have these remarkable kind of coincidences, which are a, kind of manifestation of that. So, yeah, there's many good books. I mean, you say, you know, I said Man in Time, but that's a history of sort of our understanding of time. It was written some years ago, but it's still a very, very good read. It's one of those books you might find, you know, in a charity shop, you know, somewhere, you know, for a quid. And there's an old illustrated edition that's worth picking up if you ever see that. I mean, there's one, I tell one in the book where I'm trying, it has to do with, again, hearing this phenomenon of hearing something on television or the radio at the same time that you're saying it, or just about to. And I'm trying, I can remember exactly what my editor on this book had sent me email about the progress of the book, and I was writing to him about it, and something else in it having to do with dreams at the same time that again, I'm a Radio 3 listener. There was something like, oh, we have a dream team for this event or something like that. So, I mean, again, it's the kind of thing you step over a line, and sometimes it's like, okay, let's put this aside for a while. It's like you want it to all mean something, and that's the ticklish thing too, because that's the Kessler's inkfish effect, is you can get close to it sort of all figuring to mean something, and then some strange thing happens. So, I mean, I generally think it's whatever it might be, guardian angel, higher beings, whoever, the same intelligence that's responsible for dreams is responsible for, well, I talk about my experiences with the I Ching, where there's certainly an intelligence. How 3 coins thrown down in a book, you know, whatever, written over many centuries ago, can actually, you know, not only say something intelligent about my own experience, but can, reprimand me for asking twice, which it does. Youthful folly. I mean, that just happens. So who is that intelligence? It's my own intelligence, but I don't have a direct connection to it in some way, but I can get to it through these roundabout sorts of ways. Yeah, I mean, that's, I don't know if it's aging. As I said, I know I go through times when I have a lot of dreams. I spend a lot of time writing them down in the morning, and then other ones it's like, or they're really boring. And you start to think, Jung's idea of them being, compensation for your waking state. And I think, well, this is boring. I'm not really hepped up and excited in my waking state, so this dream should not be so boring. Yeah, lucid dream, I don't have them as many. As often. I did quite some time ago when in the early days of keeping the dream journals. And then I remember them being very much associated with flying dreams too. So if you have flying dreams, which I don't have that many of those anymore, or dreams in which you're sort of floating up above. I remember one, being on one and pulling myself along by the telephone wires and things of that sort. I mean, one of the things that, and again, it's different times, when a couple of years ago, I went through a period of quite a bit of emotional turmoil, and the dream activity then was, phenomenal, and it just went on and on, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, Jung even says as you get older, you don't dream as much. He said in his case, he had integrated his unconscious to his waking, state, his ego. So he didn't need the dreams as much, but maybe that was, he made a virtue of necessity. So I don't know. I mean, I still write them down. I mean, every little thing I write down, every little coincidence and things like that, I write it down. And so I tend to think if you keep the attention in that way, he, she, Edgar, whoever it is, will respond. Well, my pleasure. And yeah, everyone sleep on it. So, okay, bye-bye now. Bye-bye.